All right, so today we're going to do a deep dive into the life and legacy of Ludwig van Beethoven. I know what you're thinking. Haven't we all heard Ode to Joy enough? And probably that dramatic beginning of the Fifth Symphony too. But we're going to try to uncover the man behind the music, beyond, just the typical deaf composer label. We're going to try and get a little more complex. We've got biographical sketches, some fascinating anecdotes, and even some mysteries we're going to look at. One thing that's really interesting to me is that we're not just, going over a timeline, but we're going to trace the evolution of a musical genius. And his work helped shape the transition between two major eras.
It really is fascinating how his music kind of sits right there on that line between classical and romantic periods. One of our sources even mentions that Beethoven's compositions spanned the transition from the classical period to the romantic era. So he wasn't just a witness to the shift, he was kind of a driving force behind it.
Okay, so how did he bridge those two worlds? Did he just get rid of the rules of the classical period, or was it more subtle than that?
It was a gradual evolution, really. You can really hear it in his music. He started with a solid foundation in the classical style, like those clear structures, elegant melodies, but he gradually infused it with this intense, almost raw emotionality that became the hallmark of Romanticism.
So it's like he took the precision and order of the classical era and injected it with, like, I don't know, would you say drama? So to understand Beethoven, is it fair to say that understanding this evolution is key?
Absolutely. And a really good way to understand that evolution is to look at how his work is actually categorized. Just like a symphony with, its distinct movements, Beethoven's musical life is often divided into three periods: early, middle, and late. Each one shows a different part of his creative journey.
And his middle period, I have to mention this, it's often called heroic. I mean, come on, that's a great title. It also makes you think, what makes it so heroic?
Yeah, it's not just, a volume or bombast. That heroic period is when you really hear Beethoven kind of breaking free from the classical era. There's a boldness and grandeur in his compositions that's exciting and heroic.
So he was pushing boundaries,
Yeah.
experimenting with new sounds and forms. And to think this was all happening while his hearing was deteriorating, I mean, that just blows my mind. Before we get into that, though, I have to bring up just how much music he produced. I mean, everyone knows the Fifth and the Ninth Symphonies, but he didn't just stop there, right?
Oh, no, not even close. We're talking a massive catalog of work. He composed piano concertos. The Emperor Concerto is one of the most famous. He did string quartets. And even an opera, Fidelio. It seems like Beethoven just wasn't content to stick with just one genre. He had to explore it all.
Like this boundless energy was just flowing through him, this need to just put every musical idea into existence. And speaking of energy, the stories about his personality are almost as legendary as his music. One source describes these washing ceremonies that he would do. He'd be pouring water all over his floors. Can you imagine being his neighbor?
It really gives you a glimpse into a mind that was just consumed by creativity, maybe to the point where just, everyday concerns just seemed small. And there's that famous anecdote about him meticulously counting 60 coffee beans for each cup.
Okay, that one I kind of get. I could be a little particular about my coffee routine too,
Yeah.
but I don't think I've reached 60 beans yet.
Well, with Beethoven, it went beyond just coffee. He would, wander through the woods for hours, composing in a frenzy, waving his arms, muttering to himself.
It sounds like something straight out of a movie.
Mm.
But I guess those walks produced some pretty iconic music.
Yeah.
But was this just him being quirky, or was there something more to it? I mean, was this just him being unconventional, or was it somehow linked to his genius?
That's a good question. And it leads to a more challenging aspect of his personality. Because Beethoven wasn't always, the charming, eccentric genius. He did have a reputation for being difficult, demanding, even prone to outbursts.
Right, and one source mentions him throwing a hot meal at a waiter because he wasn't happy with the service. And apparently, he would call out audience members if they talked during his performances.
Well, that brings up a question. Was this simply him being eccentric, or did his hearing loss and his other struggles contribute to these behaviors? It's something to keep in mind.
Definitely. And speaking of his deafness, that's not something we can just gloss over. I mean, it wasn't just some biographical detail. It fundamentally shaped his life and work.
Just imagine the willpower it must have taken to compose some of the most powerful music in history while he was losing his hearing. It's almost impossible to imagine. But Beethoven did just that.
And one of those poignant examples is the premiere of his Ninth Symphony. He conducted the entire performance, and he was completely deaf to the audience's applause.
It really shows how resilient he was, his refusal to just be defeated by his circumstances. But, his health problems went beyond just hearing loss.
Right. Our sources show a whole bunch of issues: liver and kidney damage, chronic pain. There's even evidence of lead poisoning,
Yeah.
which could explain some of his more erratic behavior. And we know a lot more about heavy metal toxicity now. It's kind of tragic to think how that might have impacted him. And it wasn't just physical issues he was dealing with. Beethoven also experienced his share of heartbreak, right?
Oh, yes. The mystery of the immortal beloved is one of the most enduring mysteries of his life. This passionate love letter that he wrote, but never sent, really offers a look into his emotional world, a side that's often overshadowed by his musical achievements.
I know, it's so tantalizing. The letter's filled with these intense declarations of love, but it's addressed simply to my immortal beloved. Who is this mysterious muse?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Scholars have been debating her identity for centuries. Some think it was Antony Brentano, a one Beethoven was close to. Others say it could have been Josephine Brunswick, another potential love interest. But without any real evidence, the immortal beloved is still an enigma.
It reminds us that even figures as monumental as Beethoven had private lives, filled with secrets, desires, and unanswered questions. It makes him seem a little more human, don't you think?
Definitely. And speaking of unanswered questions, even Beethoven's death has a bit of mystery surrounding it.
Really? I always just assumed we knew that he died from complications from his health problems.
Well, that's generally what people agree on, yes. The sources point to a mix of heavy metal poisoning, liver disease, and maybe hepatitis. But then there's the matter of his supposed last words, plaudit metzice commedia finita est, which means, applaud friends, the comedy is over. Pretty dramatic exit line, don't you think?
Yeah, it is. But are we sure those were actually his last words?
Well, that's where the mystery lies. Some sources dispute them, saying there's no evidence to support that he said those words.
So even the end of his story is up for interpretation. It makes you wonder how much of what we know about these historical figures is actually fact versus, speculation and myth. It's a good reminder to look at these stories critically, don't you think?
I agree. And it's a reminder that history is always being reshaped as we find new evidence and new perspectives.
Which brings us to another interesting part of Beethoven's legacy. He continues to surprise us, even after his death, like the discovery of Für Elise.
Oh yeah, imagine one of his most loved pieces being hidden away for decades and only found 40 years after he died.
It really makes you wonder what other treasures might still be out there somewhere.
It's almost like he's still speaking to us from beyond the grave. And it's not just his music. The sources mention that Beethoven's ear bones were saved after his death, and they are still studied by medical researchers.
Wow, that's incredible. It really shows how figures from the past can still resonate with us in ways we never imagined. It's like his story is still being written even centuries later.
That's exactly right. And that's the beauty of looking into a life like Beethoven's. There's always something more to find, some new layer to uncover.
So as we move on to the next part of our deep dive, I'm curious, what stood out to you so far? What's grabbing your attention?
For me, it's the contrast, between his outer struggles and his inner world. I mean, we see this guy battling deafness, physical pain, maybe even mental anguish. Yet he's creating these unbelievably powerful, joyful, transcendent pieces of art. It makes you wonder just how deep his creative spirit really was.
Yeah, it's like his music was this, conduit for something bigger than himself, something beyond his own problems. Let's go back to that immortal beloved for a minute.
Yeah.
It's really a fascinating piece of the puzzle, wouldn't you say? Are there any clues as to why he never sent that letter?
It's a question that's led to so much speculation. Some theories suggest that, maybe the relationship was impossible, maybe due to social barriers, or even that she was already married. Others believe that Beethoven, who was always, a little tormented, self-critical, maybe he just hesitated, afraid of rejection or of messing with his creative process.
So maybe a mix of, things stopping him from the outside and struggles from within, like a real-life romantic drama, but happening inside this larger-than-life figure.
Yeah.
Speaking of drama, though, you said earlier that Beethoven's death had some mystery to it.
Yeah, I mean, the official cause points to those health problems we talked about. Liver disease, maybe lead poisoning. But there's something intriguing about his last moments, those last words, applaud, friends, the comedy is over. People have debated them for ages.
Now that you mention it, it does sound like something out of a play.
Yeah.
Like a self-aware exit line, almost.
Yeah, exactly. Some scholars believe it's exactly that, just a romanticized version of his death, a story that got around to make him more legendary. But others say those words, whether he meant them as a joke or real reflection. They offer a peek into how he was feeling at the end.
So we're left wondering, was he making a joke about his suffering, trying to find some humor in death? Or was it more profound, about the human condition, the drama that's part of life itself?
It really is something to think about, and it reminds us that even in death, Beethoven is still challenging our assumptions and making us curious. But even if we put aside those last words, there's something interesting about how his final years were full of both decline and incredible artistic creation. His late string quartets, which he composed when he could barely hear, are thought to be some of his most profound and challenging works.
You mentioned those earlier, but we haven't really talked about why they're so special. What makes them so complex and challenging? And why are they so revered?
Well, try to imagine expressing the full range of human emotion through music when you yourself can barely hear. These late quartets, it's like you're looking into Beethoven's soul, witnessing his struggle with death, with trying to find meaning in suffering. They're not always the easiest to listen to. They're dense, introspective, full of dissonance and unexpected changes. But for those willing to really listen to them, they offer an incredibly profound musical journey.
It's like he was taking musical expression even further.
Exploring new areas of sound and emotion. And as his body was failing him, it's amazing.
Definitely. And it's a testament to the power of the human spirit, wouldn't you say?
I completely agree. And it shows why people are so fascinated with Beethoven. It's not just his triumphant, heroic music. It's also the vulnerability, the struggle, the human story behind the notes.
And we have to bring up Furley's, again, one of his most popular pieces. It wasn't even found until decades after his death. How is it possible that a piece so well known could be lost for so long?
I think it shows just how much music Beethoven wrote. And it also shows how music manuscripts were handled back then. It makes you wonder what other treasures might still be out there. The fact that Fur-Elise eventually got out into the world, and that centuries later, audiences still love it. I mean, that really shows how timeless his music is.
And it's not just the music itself that's still fascinating. You mentioned earlier that his ear bones were preserved. That's a pretty unique legacy. What can scientists even learn from studying them all these years later?
It might seem a little strange, but by studying his ear bones, researchers can learn about how his hearing loss progressed, and maybe even figure out what caused it. This could help us understand the difficulties he faced as a composer, the incredible things he did in spite of them. It's a way of connecting with the reality of his life, closing the gap between the man and the myth.
It's like we're all still trying to figure him out,
Yeah.
to put together the whole picture of this really complex person. But besides the science, there's something almost poetic about it, that his ears, the way he experienced sound, are still with us today.
It really shows us that even though he lived centuries ago, his story is still going on, still affecting us in ways we may never fully understand.
So as we get to the end of our deep dive, I'm curious, what's the biggest thing you've taken away? What image of Beethoven will you remember? For me, it's got to be that image of resilience, We talked about his struggles, how eccentric he was, but what sticks with me is this, incredible creative force that just would not be silenced even with all that loss. It's pretty inspiring to think about what he did, with all those challenges.
Yeah, I agree. It's proof that the human spirit can overcome anything and create something truly meaningful. And I think that's why his music still resonates with people of all ages and backgrounds, It speaks to something in us, this desire to connect, to express ourselves, to find beauty in the middle of chaos.
So for our listener, if they want to experience more of Beethoven's music, where would you suggest they start?
Well, if you're looking for, heroic Beethoven, like we talked about, I'd say Symphony No. 5. That opening, da-da-da-da-a, everyone knows it. And it's so powerful. It really embodies, the struggle and triumph we were talking about.
That's a great suggestion. What about for something a little more, intimate, something from those later years? Maybe one of the string quartet.
Oh, for sure. They do require a bit more attention, You have to be willing to sit with the complexity and the emotional depth, but they're so rewarding. If you're new to the late quartets, I'd recommend String Quartet No. 14 in C-sharp minor, Opus 131. It's a really moving piece, and it shows Beethoven's genius in a whole new way.
And for those who are interested in the immortal beloved mystery, where could they go to learn more?
There's tons of books and articles out there, all trying to figure out who she was and why he never sent the letter. You could get lost looking into it all. But it's interesting to see how different people have interpreted the clues. and come up with their own stories. It shows that history is always open to interpretation, that there are always different ways to look at things.
Like we're all detectives, trying to solve the mysteries of the past.
Yeah.
But I think the biggest thing we've learned today is that there's always something new to learn.
Absolutely. And I hope our listeners will keep exploring Beethoven's life and music. It's a journey that can last your whole life.
I love that. Well, it's been great talking about all this with you. And to our listener, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Ludwig van Beethoven. We hope you've gained a new appreciation for the man, the music, and how he's still relevant today.